So a couple of days ago, I released a video about the Neve 1073, and there was a surprising amount I wanted to actually say about it, but I couldn't because I was trying to keep the video under 10 minutes long. Fortunately, some of you in the comments actually requested an in-depth tutorial on the 1073, so this is a great chance for me to dive deeper and say more of the things I wanted to say about it, as well as give you content that you're looking for. And as always, please like and subscribe if you like this content, and please also comment, because this is how I know what kind of content you guys are looking for. So I want to start by actually talking about the Slate versions of the 1073, because this is the first version of like a 1073 emulation that I encountered when I was first getting into third-party plugins and things like that. And I imagine a lot of you probably have this in your collection. So I thought it'd be a good place to start. Now there are two versions of the 1073, or I should say two different modules representing the 1073 in the virtual mix rack. You have the FG73, which is mimicking like the preamp section, and then you have the FGN, which emulates the EQ, but not just the EQ, it actually also includes the line input as well. The FG73 was designed to work with Slate's virtual microphone system, which I don't really know much about, and for our purposes today isn't entirely relevant. So we're just going to focus on the FGN. So let's start by talking about the input section here, and we'll talk about this red knob. This is one of the defining visual features of the 1073, and you'll notice that at the bottom here it says line right underneath the knob, and that's because this particular plugin is simulating the gain structure of the line input of the 1073, which depending on your signal allows you to push it pretty far before it starts to distort. So you can get a lot of harmonics that way. You can really fatten up your signal, which is what the 1073 is really famous for. Now you have this drive button here as well. All this does is compensates the gain. So as you push this up, if you didn't have this engaged, the signal would get louder. But when we push this drive button, it basically allows you to add all the distortion and or harmonics that you want without making it any louder. This is a feature of the Sheps 73 by Waves as well. It's very subtle when everything is flat, but when we start boosting our filter gains, that's when we really start to notice. Let's talk about the EQ. Now, it's not uncommon for preamplifiers to also have equalizers on them, and this is the case with the 1073, which has a 3-band EQ and a high-pass filter. Now, if you're like me, when I was first starting out in recording, this might seem counterintuitive. Why would you put a mixing tool, an equalizer, with a recording tool, a preamp? To me, it seemed unsafe to use an EQ going in because then you're committed to that sound. But here's the thing, anytime we're making any choice during the recording process, we are committing to a sound. For example, if you chose a Ludwig Black Beauty snare drum over a Superlight, you're committing to the sound of the Black Beauty. If you opt for a coated head over a clear head, you're choosing the sound of a coated head. If you use an SM57 over a different microphone, you're choosing the sound of the SM57. So having an EQ on your preamp really is just the last step in shaping your tone, which is already the accumulation of hundreds of choices you've made up to that point. Because it has very broad musical EQ curves at crossover points that were very deliberately chosen by Rupert Neve and company. And that's actually something kind of important to note, that although kind of given the visual layout of this particular plugin, this effect here kind of seems like an afterthought. That it's an EQ first and then it adds some distortion. But in reality, this input is very, very important to how the rest of the plugin sounds, because the signal is hitting the input section first, and then we are driving that signal into the EQ. So the harder we push this, the more harmonics and distortion we're also going to get as we start boosting our EQ. Another thing to note is that the crossover frequencies are exactly the same as they were on the original 1073. But unlike other UAD plugins, the frequency selector is variable. So I can choose any frequency within this 360 to 7.2K range, which I think is nice, but I actually really like the fact that the frequency selector on the original 1073 is stepped, because it kind of simplifies my decision-making process. So what I like to do is just click on these numbers to just jump right to them. And something else that Slate did that I think is really cool is add a second mid-range band, because it's not uncommon to need to use more than one, especially on something like bass where I'm boosting a lot in the lower mid-range, but also want to get more of that string jangly sound in the upper mid-range between like 1 and 2K. Okay, now let's move on to the UAD version of the 1073 because it's going to look and act a lot more similarly to the original hardware. So we've got the same iconic red knob as we saw on the FGN. So the red knob here essentially represents this range right here, from this off position up to -20, but you do still have the option to use the mic input as well, which will very quickly distort your signal if you're sending a line level signal into it, which is sometimes what you want. People really like to use the mic input of a 1073 as a distortion box, but you just got to make sure to compensate here because it will get extremely loud. And the reason for that is because the UAD plugins can be actual mic preamps. I'm actually using one right now. So I have an Apollo, and so I have a 1073 on my unison channel, which essentially changes the gain stage of the physical preamp in my Apollo interface. So here you can see that I'm actually using the mic signal and I can control it with my volume knob. I have it turned quite high here, and you notice there's no distortion or anything like that happening because the microphone I'm using is a very low sensitivity microphone. So one thing to note about the gain markers around the red knob is that they are negative numbers because they don't actually refer to the increased gain after preamplification. They refer to the expected level of the incoming signal. Now, there are a lot of ways to bypass this thing. You can bypass it with Cubase's host bypass. You can use UAD's plugin bypass that's like on all of their plugins. You can use the switch down here, and then you can also use one of two off positions on the red knob. Now this is interesting. Why do we have two different off positions on our red knob gain selector? Well, the reason for that is the fact that we are controlling two different input stages with a single knob. We have our line input and we have our mic input, and they both have their own unique gain structures, but their ranges do overlap. And these off positions were strategically placed so that you could never have both the line input and the mic input on at the same time, which would cause crosstalk and interference between the two signal paths. It could cause damage in some cases. So this is just a clever way of ensuring that you don't run into any kind of interference between the two signal paths. Okay, so let's talk about the EQ. First thing you need to do in order to use the EQ is to turn it on. Now, as soon as we turn on this EQ, you'll see that we've got this very broad kind of musical boost in the upper mid-range. And this will actually change depending on which crossover frequency you have selected. So before we're even boosting or cutting anything, if I just switch my crossover frequency, it will change the overall frequency response of the signal. Now, as you can see here, I'm just clicking on these numbers, which is easiest for me, but you can also just grab this outer ring and pull it up or down, and that will also cycle through your selections. And now we have our gain knob. So if I push to the left here, it'll boost it. Push to the right, it'll cut it. And you'll notice that these EQ curves are very, very broad, right? So 1073 is often referred to as like a very musical EQ. And generally this is what people mean when they're talking about EQs being musical. It's that the EQ curves themselves are very broad. In addition to being broad, the Q factor is also proportional, at least it looks proportional. So the harder I boost this, the narrower the actual Q factor becomes. And this is what, in my opinion, makes the EQ on the 1073 such a great pairing with the preamp section, because it really allows you to shape your sound going in. And I've talked about this before, but you can get very aggressive with the 1073's EQ without really like fundamentally changing like the character of the instrument you're applying it to. Okay, and then we also have an 18 dB per octave high pass filter here, which is very handy. And then we have our output section. So we have two ways to control the output volume, our clean output, as I call it. So this is controlling the actual output from the plugin, and so it has no sonic character to it. But then we have this fader as well, which is modeled off of an actual fader from a Neve console. UAD hasn't hasn't specified which one. I know that this plugin was modeled after a 1073 unit from the 8014 console, so probably this fader is from that console as well, but it could be from the A88 or something like that. But it is a Neve fader. I don't know if they use like a VCA or what for these faders, but point being, the fader does have sonic characteristics to it as well, and this has no sonic characteristic to it at all. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this deeper dive into the Neve 1073, and I hope you feel a little bit more confident now when using one. As always, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. I love hearing from you guys, and this is how I know what kind of content you're looking for. And of course, if you or someone you know is in need of any kind of music-related services, such as recording, mixing, mastering, help with songwriting, arrangements, I will leave a link to my SoundBetter profile as well as my email in the description below. Till then, have a great day.